Hello, Megagame Adrian. You are precisely 1 minute early. Congratulations. 1 minute early. Congratulations. Okay. All right. Let's give it a second because we're not actually at half past yet. So we'll give people a moment or two. This is the weird part when you're just kind of waiting for people to arrive, waiting to start. How has quarantine been treating you, John?
I've been on all right. I spend an inordinate amount of time in my own house during normal times anyway. Uh, so I've been just sort of handling it.
Yeah, okay, that's good. I haven't quite gone stir crazy yet, though I have been growing the beard more and more and more.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I only shaved for the first time since lockdown started this morning, specifically just for this. I haven't really had a reason to now.
Well, we thank you for grooming, especially for the audience of
Mm,
this. Original Wiggles would like you to know you're hot.
brilliant. Yeah. Well, cooler now with the beard off, but I see what you mean.
Cool. Okay, let's get started. And so, I'm Mr Megagame, aka Matt Bambridge, and with me today is John Mizon, the founder of Southwest Megagames, designer of Denner Walls, among others. John, I think you also kind of set up games in Cardiff, Cheltenham, Gloucester, Bristol, Bournemouth, Southampton, and Reading.
Yeah, and Oxford and Swindon, and occasionally London, but that's more of a me guesting for other people.
Yeah, okie dokie.
But
Well,
yeah,
yeah,
generally in the southwest. Yeah.
excellent. So John's been Megame for a few years, and obviously Den Wars is absolutely wildly successful, which is why you're all here tonight. Thank you for the regulars, Megame Adrian, Hallie Hank, Jerry. It's good to see you. So you know how this works, guys. Pump those questions into the chat for me, so we can ask John those questions. Let's get the first one in. Come on, Hallie Hank, you're usually good for a question. What you got for me? So Haliank is saying that he on Facebook that he asked questions and now he's been singled out. So come on, you've got to have a question for me there, someone, one of you, or we'll go to the Survey Monkey to kick off. Okay. So first one from Ross M from Survey Monkey. Do you think there's a satisfying way for Mega Games to have a winner?
I guess you have to have a long, complicated, and boring discussion about what winner means. So let's do that. So I'll try and keep it brief.
No,
So
go for it. We've got
I
time. Go for it.
think I think quite a lot of mega games do have winners in some ways, and I think that's fine and it's good because um, as I've always said, I've always personally enjoyed mega games as storytelling experiences, and it's natural for in stories some people to come out on top or more successful. So if you're looking at winners, like I think it's perfectly fine that someone comes out on top because of things that make sense for whatever the story was, whether it was good strategy or a certain amount of luck or working the room or the narrative to their own ends, or more likely a combination of those factors, or something else. In terms of a more kind of objective winner, sort of a board game style winner, um, I think it really depends on how you do it, but it's complicated to say that because I haven't really had any mega game experiences with objective victory points. I mean, obviously there'll always be how many resources do you have at the end, and stuff like that, but it's never really considered in that way. So I guess it depends. I've never really had enough experience to really answer a question about objective victory points, but I think it could work as long as like those points aren't the only thing you're working towards. Like, I mean, it's like I said, right? You can total up the number of resources you have in a mega game. You can say, I had the most money at the end, or I had the most whatever the main resource of the game is, political resource. and sort of consider yourself a winner in that sense. And I guess a lot of mega games are like that, where you can say, well, I did the best in this way, but obviously, everyone else had satisfying experiences, and they probably had some successes along the way, even if they didn't end up being super successful. Um, and some people don't really mind losing at all because it's just about the narrative. So I think you can definitely have satisfying winning experiences. It's more about what is your game about? What makes your game enjoying and satisfying to people? And if the answer is only winning and only winning in an explicit way, then obviously whoever doesn't win won't have the satisfying experience. So it's really more about that question at the end of the day, I think.
Okay. So, do you think that a mega game that had more explicit win conditions could help bring in? This is from me now. A mega game that had more explicit win conditions would help bring in a different crowd to mega gamers. So, I feel at the moment, mega gaming obviously is a very broad church of all different kind of types of people. But if you were to run a big old mega game and it had Twilight Imperium style victory points, and a mega game is, a tad shorter than Twilight Imperium, which takes roughly the entire span of your adult life to play. Um, what do you think? Do you hope it would bring in a different crowd?
Um, I don't know. I think uh, so. My personal experience, because before I did mega games, most of the sort of analog gaming I did was board games, with a little bit of RPG. Um, and I think that as a board game player, I saw mega games and I wasn't necessarily taken in by the idea, the board game elements of them. It was more that, a similar gaming experience in terms of accessibility and um, there being something tangible to it and being there. But it was more about what they were creating outside of that, the sort of the simulation and the narratives that pulled me in. So I think maybe there are some board gamers out there who would appreciate the rigidity and structure of like a board game with explicit points and stuff. And I can't think of a single example right now, but I'm sure there must be board games out there which are just have a large player count and also someone can literally win them. Um, I want to say it's called Operation Overlord, but I think that might be incorrect. I'm not sure. But Memoir 44 has like a
Yeah.
8-player version, which obviously isn't quite mega game level, but it's sort of getting there. Where instead of one on one, you have two teams of three, and each member of the team controls like a different area, and then there's a fourth player who's sort of doing overall command for both sides. And that felt to me somewhat like a mega game, except it was explicitly like a board game with victory points and what have you. So I think there's definitely people out there who, if they want, a large board game where you can score points, that's out there, and I think it would be designed very differently. Um, and I don't know if uh, if mega games doing that would necessarily bring in more people because you have to balance out the people who would like that with the people who might not want to attend that kind of game. So you'd have to see how it goes.
Yep. Okay. That's fair. All right. Let's move on to the next one. So, how long did it take you to balance Den of Wolves for Mahaly Hank?
Oh, I guess it depends. So one thing you'll notice when you're asking me questions is I tend to say that I can't answer them without first asking a second question. But I guess it depends what you mean by balance. But if I assume what you mean is essentially having the resources be at an appropriate number for the game. Um, and I guess probably only a couple of days or so in the grand scheme of things. Obviously, there was a long progress. There was a long process of me, deciding how much each ship would generate based on what facilities were on the ship. And then really it was just about putting that into a spreadsheet and then seeing what sort of all the inputs and all the outputs would be and having them make sense. If you're talking about the combat balance, some of that is sort of up to control. Some of it is just like the food and water, just how much goes in, how much goes out. Make sure it's something sensible so that there's not a no threat situation or a all threat situation where everything's catastrophically and irreparably destroyed. Um, so yeah, if you put it all in a spreadsheet and you just add it all up, one side against the other, then it's not that long. That's not really where the bulk of the time tends to go.
Yeah. So there's the balancing of resources there. So how did you balance things like shuttles, which are the big kind of bottleneck in Den of Wolves, and most importantly, the undercover roles, those damn dirty toasters?
Hmm. Um, so the shuttles, well, the shuttles were actually not in the very first run of Den of Wolves. It was a player suggestion to essentially just make things harder because in the first run, the general gist of it was there needs to be some more problems to create more tension and more things to work on whilst you're playing. Um, and generally, I gave those out partially based on what would make sense narratively. So, um, ships that are essentially built around being big resource makers would have big resource shuttles. And the military shuttle has one because, of course, it's designed for emergency situations where you might need that kind of thing. And to some extent, it was about giving the people on those ships slightly more power, slightly more agency, because obviously once they have that they become slightly more important in the fleet as a result. Um, so that was sort of that. In terms of the traitor mechanic and who you make into a traitor, um, yeah, it's just about sort of careful casting, really, as much as you can. One sec. Pardon me.
No worries.
So you can um, essentially what I do is I look at all the players. Some players will explicitly just ask me if they can be a wolf trader, and I'd
Yeah.
say there's an average of one or two of those every single game, which makes it easier because often can be just well, yeah, sure. And then it's generally whose personality would suit it. Who's A up for anything, and B like willing to play like two games at once, which is sort of what you're doing when you're a wolf infiltrator. Um, and see sort of where are they actually playing in the fleet. Like it would be pretty rubbish if all three wolves were on the same team, because it would essentially be kind of too easy for them to coordinate, which isn't fun. And also, they just have total control of the ship and no control on any of the other ships, and it wouldn't really be as dynamic. You want that kind of thing where they're sort of lightly spread all over the place. So I tend to try and make sure there's one on the council. Not always though, because sometimes it just doesn't work that way. Sometimes it's just good to keep things fresh. Um, and one, on the captain of something, and another one maybe in the military or in the politics sphere, or on one of the major resource generators. So that's generally how I do it.
Yep. Okay. Okay. So we're about a quarter of an hour in. I see there's a bunch of people on the stream. Thank you very much. Welcome to the stream. So chuck questions into the side. More questions. Let's make use of John while we've got him. This is also the first of many calls from me asking you to follow the channel, follow on Facebook and Instagram and Twitter. Trying to hit 50 subs at the moment, which I'm 3 away from, tantalizingly close. So it would help me do more of this type of thing. But first of all, questions. I want some more questions from people. But first of all, we've got one from Megagame Adrian. Did you realise that Den of Wolves was going to be so big while you were designing it, and how far away from the original idea did the final game end up?
Good question. The first one I've actually been asked many times,
Yeah.
and the answer is no, absolutely not. The Den of Wolves, I can't remember now. I think it was like the third or fourth mega game I designed, if you include redesigning existing mega games. It was my second original game, completely original. And it was sort of, there's just like, and I assume anyone who's designing at least one or more mega games has this. There's like a queue or a list of different ideas you have. And one day, just like the next item in the queue of my idea list was sort of one inspired by Battlestar Galactica because it's uh, I'd always thought that it would make for a good sort of game with some of the elements that were going on in the background. A lot of Battlestar Galactica, understandably for a television show, is about a small cast of characters and the episodic stories that they have, despite the fact that there's loads of really interesting stuff happening in the background on like a structural level. So there's black market going on that sort of only exists for one episode. There's a labor union situation with the people who make the fuel essentially being having to do so in terrible conditions, which is sort of a necessity in order to keep everyone alive, but at the same time is just like really bad for them, and they've got a strong sort of union ethic anyway. So like, how do they deal with that? Like balancing out those two problems, and loads of other stuff. Like obviously you're in an emergency situation. It's sort of semi-military, but there's still the idea that we are still a civilian-led government, etc. And there's a thing about there. I think 12 different planets. There's this really amusing moment actually. There's one planet which is sort of the main one, Caprica, and then they tell you almost nothing about the rest of the planets, but it's implied there are 12 different planets which are sort of like 12 different countries, and they all have influence on this council. Which again, stories about that as a whole almost never come up. It's more about sort of the main characters who are on that council. But yeah, there's a really funny moment where one of the characters, it's revealed that he's from a specific planet, and it's meant to be sort of like a backwoods, more rural planet where people don't think much of them, and that's sort of the twist. Even though I don't think we'd even been told that before. Sorry, it's a really good show. Otherwise, it's just a really weird moment. But anyway, so the big plot twist of this character being from this planet is revealed with him speaking in his original accent, which is like this thick Cockney accent or something like that. Or I think it's thick West Country accent. Yeah, I think it's West Country actually, but it's something ridiculous, some like rural UK accent, I'm pretty sure. And yeah, I just burst out laughing when he did it, and like the music was all like dramatic and everything, and I couldn't believe it. Anyway, I've tangented off onto a completely random rant, which I tend to do. But yeah, so no, when I was designing it, it was just sort of like, oh yeah, there's a lot of cool ideas there that you could turn into a game, and I did it, and I started designing it, and I actually finished designing it sooner than I thought, because I'd sort of designed everything into a neat little loop. Everything was sort of circled off. And I was expecting that I would add more to it, but at the end of the day, I just thought I can't add more to this without taking stuff away or kind of completely disrupting the whole balance of everything. So I thought, well, that seems small and simple, but I'll see if people like it anyway. And here we are, like 12 runs later or something, and about as many people buying the pack to run for themselves as well. So yeah, it just completely took me by surprise. I wasn't even sure if people were going to like it because, like I said, it seems so like basic. But that's one of the things that people seem to have really taken off with it, because they just sort of put their own narrative in.
Yeah, I think the beauty of what you've managed to create in that game is that it looks really simple, but it works like a charm.
Yeah.
So it's been run in Sweden, Switzerland, the UK, America. Have the Australians played it yet?
Either the Australians or the New Zealand. I honestly can't remember, and I apologise for not remembering correctly.
But yeah,
one of them.
You managed to get a game out there that is probably the second most played after Watch the Skies.
Arguably, yeah.
Yeah.
And maybe Urban Nightmare, but probably not. That was mainly just sort of a one thing for when everyone was doing it at once.
Yeah.
But yeah, that. So the second question, which I have eventually managed to get around to, was how much did the game change from the original idea? Just to say a kind of a decent amount. That it's varied, because on the one hand, it changed kind of a lot. On the one hand, there wasn't much to change from, because it was originally just a loose mess of ideas, like most game designs, which then eventually turned into an actual game. So there was stuff each ship, whilst it was associated with one nation, had populations from multiple nations. So you'd have like a vast majority population from that nation, but there was also like a small percentage of people from other nations as well. And there was a whole thing about like how far away every star was, and like mapping that out, and like a whole history of every planet that I sort of had some brainstorm notes for. And there was some other details about like military authority and how Marines and civilian authorities would interact. And like, it was just like, there's no way people are going to remember this or learn this properly. And it sounds like a lot of work for me, when I know I'm almost certainly just going to have to get rid of it or stick it in a document that most people won't really reference when it actually comes to the game. So yeah, it changed a decent amount, but only in the sense that it didn't actually change that much because there wasn't actually much for it to change from.
Yeah.
It
True.
kind of existed as I built it.
Cool. Okay. Okay. So let's go down. Who have we got next? Okay. All right. From Harry Hack. How do you balance conflict vs combat?
How do I? Sorry, could you repeat the question?
Oh, sorry.
Yeah,
How do you balance conflict vs combat?
conflict versus combat. Uh,
I suppose the
they
other
not
thing
the
there
same thing.
being, well, conflict doesn't have to be combat where combat
True,
is
combat is always
combat. I
conflict.
guess yeah.
Like that. Um, in Denver specifically, or just in making it
Any game
any game.
you've designed.
Um, I guess it's sort of about uh, typically in most mega games, if you're going to be in combat with someone, you know from the beginning, like it's explicit that you're set up that it's some kind of war scenario, or if not war scenario, then conflict scenario where factions are definitely going to be fighting in the streets or whatever the situation is. Um, and you sort of design some specifics for how that works, whereas conflict is more sort of uh, interior or for sort of people who are only loosely associated with each other, who maybe have overlapping goals but not total goals, and it's about how that sort of friction goes against each other. Like in Den of Wolves, that's sort of everyone aside from the wolves specifically, um, and that's a far more informal design, and it's more about sort of giving people the briefs that they don't trust or they don't like, or they're just not a formal block with Group B, and therefore things get a bit awkward when they have to work together because there isn't total trust, or it's very transactional and they have to exchange things to bargain with them or leverage with them. Um, and that's far less mechanical. It's more about getting the players to sort of break their own deals, make their own deals, both, I guess.
Yeah. Cool. Okay. Okay. On to the next one then. From Original Wheels. Did you choose the Mega Gaming Life, or did the Mega Gaming Life choose you?
Well, I think probably the latter, I guess. Like most people, my first sort of exposure to it was the Shut Up and Sit Down video. And I've probably told this story many times, but for the benefit of anyone who hasn't heard it, um, I saw it and then I thought, oh, I'll take a crack at designing something like that. It sounds kind of interesting. And I started like sketching out some rules and some units and how much they cost to build and stuff like that. It felt a little bit RTS inspired, to be honest, but it didn't really go very far. So there's not much I can say about it. And then I thought, for inspiration and also to help me along with this thing, see if I can flesh it out into anything. I'll just buy the official Watch the Skies pack from Joe Moore, which was back in 2015, possibly 2014. And I just looked at this game and I was like, oh, this is far better than anything I've done so far. So I'm just going to scrap all of my work and do this instead. And I did. And I ran it, and enough people came, and it was enjoyable. And I was living in Gloucester at the time, and I'd ran it in Cheltenham because it's quite close to Gloucester if you're not familiar with the area. Um, and I had previously been living in Bristol for several years, so I had a bunch of friends there, and they and their friends were all like, "Could you run it again, but in Bristol?" And so I said, "Yeah, sure." And I think it was about 6 months later, I ran Watch the Skies again in Bristol, and at that point, I was like, I could just keep doing this, and so I did, and I kept going to more and more other games as well as I sort of got more kind of comfortable with going to um, uh, London and Manchester and other places to go to Mega Games. Um, and it just sort of gradually grew. There was no sort of specific conscious choice, I think, at any point to get into Mega Games. It was very sort of organic, very sort of self-sustaining.
Well, they're quite addictive, or I at least would say
Mm.
that they're quite addictive, but possibly I'm wrong person to say.
I didn't
Okay.
know you were into Mega Games.
But not to just an occasional dabbler, John.
Mm.
So from Becky Vlogs, hello Becky Vlogs. I've been watching BSG off the back of the online dinner walls. I can completely see why you turned it into a mega game. Were
Mm.
there any aspects of the show that were in earlier drafts of the game that kind of got cut, e.g., a population tracker or anything really?
Not the first person to ask, could you have a population tracker? Because obviously it's a massive part of the show and it's a very sort of interesting dynamic and it's an interesting way of tracking how well you're doing in a way. I did consider it, but I did eventually remove it, obviously, for anyone who's played the game. And the main reason was essentially it's too complex to sort of actually update. You'd have to know about every bad thing or, I guess, good thing that happened on every ship. Um, you also have to assign it a very strict number, which is something you tend to avoid in mega game design because it's hard to keep things consistent if they're very inflexible. Um, and just that kind of stuff. Like, there's so many details to update, and I felt like it probably wouldn't be worth it for the amount of work and the amount it took out from other parts of the game. Um, so that was essentially removed. There wasn't that much else I removed. Like I said earlier, there were a bunch of details that I removed because they were kind of extraneous or they didn't make sense with what I was doing, or the game just needed to be simplified to work properly. Um, but yeah, there wasn't really that much from the show. I think there's definitely one thing I remember, which was I originally planned to have a sort of fatigue or stress level for the fighter pilots, because that's a big part of the show. I think there's a whole episode dedicated to just that. As about like every time they went out, they'd like acquire a certain amount of stress, and you could like overload them with stress in order to keep them flying. Um, but yeah, again, just too much detail eventually got cut out. And I think as anyone who's played the main military ship role knows, it's stressful enough without adding a mechanical tracker to that.
Not so, I'm sure playing the Aegis is an absolute cakewalk. All right, okay. So next one from Jerry. So when did you last try and define a mega game?
So the thing, the thing with being me is that a decent number of people I interact with on a day-to-day basis have never heard of Mega Games. So I have to do something along those lines fairly frequently. Whenever I have to explain what my job is to people, or explain what my hobbies are to people. So yeah, I don't know the exact date, but you can assume I'm doing it on average 1 to 2 times a week.
Uh, uh, we've got Johan OH in the chat, and he's telling you to stop, no, don't define mega games. But no, continue to
That
fight.
wasn't the question. I'm glad it wasn't.
Okay, so on to the rest of Jerry's question there. How do you deal with no-shows in a cast game, and what do you do when a player just walks out, both there and then and afterwards? That's a really good question, Jerry.
So thankfully no shows and walkouts are pretty rare. I'd say on average there's one no show a mega game. And unfortunately, that average tends to be because there's a bunch of mega games where there's zero no shows, and occasionally you'll have one where there's like 3 or 4 or more. Um, but yeah, generally it's not that big a deal. There'll tend to be a certain amount of overlap in the game, where you can remove a role without the whole thing falling apart. And when that happens, you can just either hope that whoever didn't show was one of those roles, or um, pull someone out of one of those roles to replace the missing person if they were a key role. Um, if neither of those are possible, or indeed even if you are doing that, it can also be useful to have control essentially step in as a just sort of administrative assistant and being like, I know you have stuff you want to get done in this turn, and for unrelated reasons that aren't your fault, you aren't able to, so I want to help you do as much of it as you can. So obviously have control step in and do that is very useful. With walking out, it's pretty much the same thing, obviously, except for what to do after that. To my knowledge, I've only had 2 people actually walk out in the middle of the game. One of them was someone who was extremely polite about it and basically just said, I appreciate what you're doing. It's kind of experimental, and I think just what I have isn't working for me. But thank you very much. And they left. and I offered them a refund after the game via email. And they took it, but they also said like they weren't annoyed or anything. They were just like, it just wasn't for me.
Yeah.
The other time it happened, the person just disappeared, kind of without saying anything, and we didn't realize they were gone for like another half an hour or something. Thankfully, at least from a mechanical perspective, I think they were on the press team. And so, as anyone who's familiar with Megagames will know, the press team is fairly flexible. It's mainly people sort of going around doing on the fly news stuff, news reporting, news gathering. So it's not a massive like key loss to lose one of them because they're not doing anything specific that can't be replaced. What I would say is if you are ever considering doing that, please at least tell someone you're leaving, just in case there's like a fire or something, because I would have been very concerned if we couldn't find that person in that kind of event. But yeah, I just never heard from them again. So I don't know, maybe it wasn't for them. But yeah. So yeah, like I said, if someone walks out in the middle, then you do pretty much what you do for no shows. Pull someone out of a non-key role if they were a key role, or if not, the game can hopefully adapt with a certain amount of flexibility. And either way, have control help them if there's any way they can.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Okay. So we're about half hour in. Thanks again, John. I can see a bunch of you there in the chat. So let's have some more questions.
I just noticed that Becky said I spoiled it for her. It's an incredibly lame and, to be honest, unimpactful twist. Don't worry about it. You could skip the whole episode and it probably wouldn't change anything.
Also, what is that now? A 15-year-old show?
I don't know, possibly.
Um, pop some more questions into the chat so we can continue grilling John for another half hour. We're here. Thank you very much. And this is probably only two more times after this where I ask you to follow the channel, aiming for 50 follows and then beyond. So 3 to go, tantalizingly close. So it'll kind of help me do more and follow me and John on Facebook and Twitter and stuff. That also helps us feature a larger audience and do more stuff with Megagames. But right now, more questions would be great. So if you're watching, chuck some more questions into the chat for us. But first, we got one from Ben2Many0677. How do you cater for replayability between runs of Donor Walls?
A lot of the time, it's a completely different or almost completely different player set. I think the main time was Den of Wolves London, the first one, where there was a lot of people who either had played Den of Wolves once or twice before or knew a lot about it from hearsay. So I added a few more secret roles, things that weren't quite as disruptive as the traitors, but something that sort of added a different element to the game that made it slightly more surprising. But really, a lot of the replayability comes from two places. One of them is just putting people in different roles. So, I mean, Matt, I know you've played at least twice now, and generally speaking, it's just being in a different role. You know, you've got roles that are sort of more focused on the ships and maintenance and resources, and you've got ships that are more focused on comms, and you've got ships that are more focused on politics. Roles that are more focused on politics and the military. And, you know, if you sort of added them all together, there might be like 8 or 9 or 10 sort of different roles, depending on how you interpret it. But I'd say there's at least 3 or 4. So, you know, you could play it 3 or 4 times at least in almost completely different ways and from different perspectives.
Yeah.
So that's something you can do on a sort of person-to-person basis. And the second thing which makes it replayable is just it is a mega game. There's been so many sort of different ways the game's played out, different endings that you know, anyone who's played enough mega games will tell you you can play the same one twice and it's a completely different experience.
Right. Okay. Well, that's good. So we're spending a lot of time talking about Donor Wall, so we'll diverge slightly. So tell us about what other games you've designed.
Sorry?
Tell us about what other games you've designed.
First ever original game was A World Divided, which was sort of loosely based on the American War of Independence, but it was sci-fi, and essentially you had this planet, and there were, I think, 11 different colony governments on the planet along a sort of space coastline, which I established using some geographical issues on the planet. Um, and they all had sort of slightly different political views, or very different political views, depending on which one you were. And there were also some people who were on the planet before they arrived, who were slightly less technologically advanced and had some complicated relationships with new people and what that meant for them and their safety and other things going ahead. And then, of course, you had the massive spacefaring empires who were very powerful, and one of them didn't like the fact that independence was brewing, and all the interactions that you can have between all those groups, which I thought was very interesting in the historical setting, and the sci-fi setting allowed me to be sort of more flexible with it and add a few new elements. Yeah, so there was that one. Um, uh, the Sugar and Sedition is the most recent new one I have. That is based on the Cuban Revolution in the late 1950s. And it's not in a sci-fi setting, it's just that's what it is. And it's essentially about the different sort of factional resistance to the regime. So you've got essentially the government, the authoritarian government, which is becoming less and less popular. You have sort of two or three different resistance groups, and within each resistance group, there's a certain amount of internal division and factionalization. And you have the American organized crime, who are a pretty significant influence, especially in the cities, and especially given that they have quite a lot of wealth. And they're looking to try and make sure that, Cuba, which has been a gold mine for them until this point, stays within their control, or at least stays profitable. And they all sort of have different points of view, very different styles of combat and politics. And like I said, there's a lot of, in all the factions, there's a lot of sort of internal factionalization as well, which I thought was very interesting. I also have modified some games like Watch the Skies and Urban Nightmare to essentially either smooth things out that I've heard in feedback, sometimes from my own games, like with Watch the Skies, which I redesigned a second time after feedback from the first redesign, and sometimes just to sort of suit my tastes more in terms of making them what I feel would be interesting and tweaking them to that end to make them sort of a slightly different game, but with the same kind of overall narrative and stuff.
Okay. So with Sugar and Sedition, so we've kind of spoken before about how it's kind of easier to basically take a historical theme and slap it into a sci-fi setting because you can separate yourself out from any tricky areas and it gives you a bit of freedom to play around with things. So for Sugar and Sedition, why kind of keep that one in the original historical wrapping as opposed to kind of going sci-fi for War of Independence?
Well, I think the one reason would be just that I'd done the sci-fi thing and I wanted some variety, both for myself and for the audience in terms of, I haven't really done a original historical game before. I ran Crisis in Britannia a couple of times a long time ago, which isn't my original game, it's Jim Wallman's. I redesigned it slightly. So I'd never done an original historical game before, and the second one was, I don't know, when I was sort of reading about it and learning about it, it's something about it just sort of felt like I should just keep it as is. Like it seems so flavorful. And it's also not something that people know about a lot, at least not in this country. A lot of people have heard of Che Guevara and Fidel Castro and stuff, but, there's so many interesting historical details. You can tell people about the American Revolutionary War and they can tell you a bunch of stuff about, the colonies and George Washington, and it was about the British and the French and the Americans and the Native Americans and all these other people. But yeah, with Cuba, it's sort of unknown. I don't know what it was. It was just sort of this hard to define feeling that I had, which was I'd like to keep this as it is for designing this.
Yeah. Okay. All right, on to the next one. We've got Syntax 777. So, what do you think about the recent running of Den of Wolves online? Any suggestions to make? Den of Wolves already any mega game be more successful online under these current lockdown conditions. I mangled that slightly, but the gist of it basically is, what did you think of the online run of Den of Wolves? And have you got any suggestions to put Megagames online?
Um, I quite enjoyed the online run of Dead of Wolves. I was council control for the council, which was always interesting because it's pretty much it's the first time I've ever been to a Den of Wolves where I haven't been running it. So one of the things I've always secretly wanted to do is just sort of be in the council all day and watch that instead of the rest of the game, which I finally got to do, which was nice. But yeah, so it seemed pretty interesting. There was a lot of for those who weren't there, it was in a Discord server, and they used different voice channels as different rooms on the ships, which served very little purpose except for making it very narratively interesting, where you literally were like you walked through an airlock and then you went to the bridge, or you went to the brig, or whatever the hell you were doing, which really sort of lent a certain amount of weird simulation to the to the where are you mechanic. So that was interesting. One of the other things I thought that was very interesting was that because you can't see anyone, or indeed anything other than a few names on a screen, it was in some ways more immersive because you were imagining everything like a book or a fairly lightweight RPG. And though in other ways it was less immersive because without actually having players there, gesturing and moving around and talking to you and shaking your hand, like you didn't get as much of the atmosphere of sort of being in the moment with all these people, with all their emotions and all their ways of communicating that isn't just sound. So that was kind of interesting to see how that made a difference in terms of being more and less immersive. Yeah, I don't necessarily know what I'd say about feedback because I was in part of the game that really didn't necessarily need much to change. The council is a room where a bunch of people talk to each other, and that's really easy to do over voice chat, it seems. So there's that. I have no idea. I suspect they might remove shuttles for the next online run. That would be my guess, just because it was technologically very difficult for people to give people resources. And in the real game, or as I call it, the meat game, the shuttles are an intentional bottleneck for resources to make it more difficult. But it almost felt like there was enough of a challenge for people to give resources to each other anyway. But I have no idea if that's a good idea or not. It's entirely up to the people who actually ran the game, which is Johan and Niklas mainly, as to what they actually need to change. And I'm sure they've collected a decent amount of feedback about it.
Excellent. I will say, following on what you said on the council, being in the council, being a Discord saver made the council slightly easier because people exercise a little bit more control about shouting over each other, which makes it all much more civilized than your normal game. Brilliant. Well, thanks for that question, Syntax. We've got Megagame Adrian. So, any plans for a Den of Wolves 2 with multiple locations or more players like Watch the Skies did?
No, I don't know. Well, so if you're talking about like Watch the Skies 2, where they went up to like 330 players or something, I don't honestly think I'm capable of doing that. It was one hell of an endeavor, and I think only Jim Wallman or someone like that could do it because he's, got the experience of running these kinds of events, and he's got a massive kit for building everything and all the components and stuff. I don't know if you could add much to Den of Wolves without completely rewriting it, and I don't necessarily want to do that. I also want to move on to new things. But yeah, it's like I said, it's sort of all designed in a neat little bow. A few people have asked me, like, can I add a ship to this? Or like, I've got more people that, I'm oversubscribed. Is there any way to add more teams? And I've always sort of told them, as far as I know, there is no like easy way to do that. Because like I said, it is all wrapped up in a neat little bow, and everything's sort of balanced with each other quite neatly. So yeah, running them simultaneously, I don't know. I think at Gen Con they ran 2 games simultaneously, and there was no obvious way to connect them like there was for the Urban Nightmare State of Chaos wide area game where they're different states. So in Den of Wolves, I think they just ran the game simultaneously, and occasionally they'd have like a brief intermission where they'd learn about what's going on in a sort of pretend parallel universe. or at least after the game they had a chat about that, which was always fun. Sort of what if scenario, but someone else is actually doing it.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah.
Okay, let's crack on. So, from Harry Hank, what I suppose you've just answered this question. So, the question was, what about adding the Pegasus, a second Battlestar, whose aims do not align with the Aegis? I suppose in some ways that might be the easiest because you just bump up the wolf threat in response, although they would
Yeah.
need to be resourced.
Yeah, you could definitely do that. I think the main reason I've shied away from that is it's a pretty massive change to the structure. For one thing, you've already got one ship, which is the military ship. And if you have a second ship come in, which is the military ship, you're sort of diluting the players on that ship and how important they are and what they do. Um, so that's one of the reasons. Essentially, in the show, it's quite interesting that you have I guess you'd say, fairly reasonable admiral, and then someone else comes in and they technically outrank him, and they're less reasonable, and so that's sort of a tension that people have. Um, but yeah, in the game, if someone comes in and says, "Well, I'm the admiral now because I outrank you," it's like, well, what is that player's actually doing in the game at this point? They could still technically be sort of coordinating their ship, but if you've got two military ships, unless you can come up with some very believable massive rivalry between them, um, without that completely disrupting the game in a bad way, you essentially just have more people on the same team, and maybe more resources for them, which doesn't necessarily seem like a good expansion to the game. It would probably work, but I mean, anything can be good if you design it well enough. But
Yeah.
like I said, it's like it's a new addition, a new feature to the game that would take a lot of work, and it's, changing what Den of Wolves is isn't necessarily something that I'm doing at the moment.
Yeah, that's
But who
fair.
knows what's going on in the future, or what other people may do with the game if they buy it themselves. You can modify it.
Okay, so the next question from Johan, what is it like to have other groups run your games? And I apologise for this. Is it hard to let it go, let it go? And how do you feel about the risk of people playing it not as intended?
Um, I guess. Well, I have the benefit, I guess, of when other people run my games, they probably live very far away, and I don't actually have to witness it. So any kind of concerns about that isn't necessarily a massive problem for me. Um, I've always sort of had live and let live attitude with this kind of stuff. If I'd say one thing that really helps me is I have a specific preference when it comes to how a mega game should be and why it's enjoyable to me and stuff. And other people sometimes will run a mega game or make decisions in a mega game when running it that are not in line with that. And I feel like I'd be sort of more concerned or worried about that if I wasn't designing and running mega games myself. Because as long as I'm designing and running mega games myself, I am contributing what I want for mega games to the world and showing that it's there and it's a thing and people can do it. Whereas if I wasn't doing that, I'd sort of feel like I didn't have that voice, and people doing things that I didn't like about mega games would probably have more of an effect on me. But like I said, I'm not that concerned about it because of this. And yeah, like I said, as far as Den of Wolves or any other pack I sell goes, I've got like instructions about what you should do and why. And if you have a different preference about how you want the game to go, and players understand that, and you've communicated it effectively, then that's fine. I've made my case, and you want to do something else, so you do it. And if people enjoy that, then that's great.
Cool. Okay, okay. Thanks for that question, Johan. So, next one from Megagame Adrian. When is Sugarins Edition coming north to Swindon slash Cheltenham?
Eventually, probably. It's a fairly small game as many games go. I think it barely cracks the 30 mark. Um, so it'd be pretty easy to get into Swindon or Cheltenham, which are slightly smaller venues.
Yeah.
But the question is, let me run the games I was already planning to run in March and April first, and and then we'll start planning more.
Yeah,
Uh,
I think that's probably fair enough. Okay, so from Original Wheels, I think I asked you this already, but was the Cuban Revolution already of interest to you? If not, what attracted you to it?
it was actually a friend of mine invited me to play Cuba Libre with him, and I had a crack at it. And one of the things with GMT games is they put like a lot of flavor into it, even though it's an extremely sort of, I don't want to call it a Euro game, but like it's a sort of dry atmosphere. There's a lot of mechanics and a lot of careful strategy, and it's one of those games where you really need to spend a lot of time on it to get good at it. I only played it once, but all of us were playing it for the first or second time, I think, so it wasn't a massive skill differential. Um, but yeah, I played that, and GMT games, despite being sort of mechanical and dry like that, they do like to put narrative in. There's a whole part of the book which explains why every sort of card is in there, all the characters, sorry, all the characters and events and historical moments and locations and stuff. And sorry, this is very embarrassing. Uh, um, yeah, and all that kind of thing, and explanations for why each faction is doing what they are, and what each faction winning means in a historical context. And one of the other things I thought was that like there's a lot of overlapping interests here, and it was sort of weird to me. I mean, at least in my head, I obviously know why they did it for the board game, why it was such a zero-sum victory, um, because like there's all kinds of ways for like teams to cooperate or not, or achieve shared goals in that scenario. And it just really struck me as a really interesting kind of mega game format, because there's so much going on in that conflict, and like I said, so much of it is sort of about factions and whether or not you're working together, and asymmetrical combat as well, which is another thing that mega games are kind of good at, because they're less about very tightly wound mechanics. Not that you can't have very well balanced, very fine asymmetrical gameplay, because things like Netrunner and other games do that very well.
Yeah.
But I personally just like asymmetrical stuff. It makes for very interesting narratives, and interesting narratives is very mega game to me. So I associate the two quite often.
Cool. Okay. So thanks for that original Rugus. Okay, yeah, and again. So how important is player enjoyment as opposed to your design vision? Is there a good balance, and what would that be?
Um, but yeah, I mean, I think I get lucky, or maybe it's just an inevitable conclusion that the two tend to overlap. Um, when I'm designing a game, my design vision is essentially the thing I would want to play. I think that's probably true for all designers, at least to an extent. So a lot of the time, I think a lot of people playing my games, if they've at least played one, or they've done some reading on it, they'll get like what it's about and why it's enjoyable, and they'll come back, and that's what they're kind of looking for, is that kind of experience. But there is definitely a balance. Some people like what I do, but not as much as I like it, and therefore they want something a bit different. And sometimes I just have to appreciate that there's something that I particularly like, but isn't very popular. And so you definitely have to strike a balance. And I think that's true for any game designer who um, is concerned about, making sure there's enough people at their games, or at the very least, is concerned about everyone leaving having had a very good time. Which I know that anyone who runs an event cares about that. But to what degree do you really want people to come away with a really good time, pretty much across the board? Which again is almost impossible. But like, how hard would you try? Would you change what you want personally to achieve that? And there's a balance you have to strike, because if you essentially sell out everything that you want, you kind of risk not knowing what other people want and getting it wrong, or just losing a certain amount of creative flair that other people don't appreciate. Um, but yeah, so it's absolutely about finding a balance, and I've definitely sort of changed my game design philosophies a little bit here and there whenever I feel like actually it'd probably just be easier and more enjoyable if I did this and didn't have this thing that I think would be really cool. And that's fine, because there's still loads of stuff that I think is really cool that I do get to put in, and it's really nice to see that happen, and it's really nice to see people enjoying the game, which at the end of the day is sort of the key thing I'm trying to achieve.
Excellent. Okie dokie. Who we got next then? So we've got Harry Hack. How much was involved in organising and actually running your first mega game after its design was finished?
Oh, well, the first one, there was a massive amount of organization and stuff. The design I didn't have to do too much of, because it was mostly Watch the Skies original version. Um, it was probably the game I changed the least. Um, that first redesign of Watch the Skies. It was mainly sort of reformatting the rulebook to make it make sense and change references to the specific original run and change a handful of mechanics that I'd based both on feedback I'd heard and asking Jim himself what he would change if he was going to run it again.
Yeah.
So there wasn't actually that much in terms of design, but there were because A, I didn't know what I was doing, and B, there wasn't as much of a very publicly visible community, or at the very least, I wasn't aware of it, or a combination of the two, which is probably the truth. Um, I didn't necessarily have a massive amount of sort of outside help in how to organize a mega game or an event in general. So it took me a while to figure out how to make all the components right and how to pick a venue and like how to produce the stuff and pack it in boxes and organize it. And without much of an existing community, I pretty much built the community in my area, at least for the first few years, on my own. With obviously with some help with some great people, but there weren't other mega game groups, is what I mean. Really, not in this effective area, especially not sort of around Cheltenham and Bristol, which is the sort of place where I really started. So that was really hard, putting a lot of effort into finding enough people and making it physically and organizing it. I think I must have spent about 8 months plus, and there was a lot of work in those 8 months plus. It was probably the game I spent the most work on before it happened, just as a result of that sort of inefficiency and incompetence.
I don't think you can call doing something entirely based off incompetence. Inefficient, fine,
Yeah.
but not so much the
Should we say
incompetence.
lack of competence?
Well, it's you saying it, so I'll let you say what you want. Okay, so from Ben, what is your approach to eliminating filler roles, and do you consider substitutions for no-shows when doing so?
Um, yeah, so the filler roles is obviously something that people are rightly annoyed about. Um, so it's about saying if I have this player or this player character, this player role, um, how do I make sure that there is something that that player will be doing? And sometimes the idea is to make that a very key, obvious thing that someone else can't do at the same time. So in Watch the Skies, you essentially have four roles, which are very explicitly like you go to this table and do this, or you go to this room and do this, and you can't have someone do both. So that's sort of a very explicit way of doing that. In Den of Wolves, you have four roles. One of them is the council, who obviously will go off and do that. But the other three are sort of all doing the same thing. And the vast majority of the feedback I get from that isn't that two of those three roles are always kind of wasted. So it's a sort of a balance of finding out what is the correct amount of work for a player character to be doing. And generally speaking, if I get enough feedback, which doesn't have to be that much, but just a significant and consistent amount that this particular player role doesn't have enough to do, then I just have to remove it because then it's not good enough to do. So you have to have that. But like I said, in reference to filling no shows, like I said with Den of Wolves, there's the three roles, and they can overlap. So it's not fine, but it's not catastrophic if you have to remove one to replace a no show. Whereas in Watch the Skies, you would essentially have to remove an entire function from that player's team, which Control could try and help fill, but it'd be difficult. So yeah, so like I said, there's sort of ways to have overlap without it being a filler role, and it's just how much activity can that person engage in. Um, yeah, so obviously filler roles aren't good, but I think it's more shades of grey than there is just explicitly filler role or not filler role.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we're coming to the end. Does anyone have any last-minute questions to ask John? Speak now or forever hold your peace. Okay, so where can people find you, John? Where can people find you and what you're doing, what's happening next? Obviously, quarantine is kind of putting a crimp in the
Mm.
mega game style a little bit. So, other than that, where can people find you and what's next?
Well, I've got the Southwest Mega Games website, which is at swmegagames.co.uk. And obviously, I've got a Facebook and a Twitter page. Feel free to find my email address at contact@swmegagames.co.uk. If you want to join the mailing list, then you can. That's got new stuff. In terms of new developments, I'm hoping to, at some point soon, release my sort of mini mega game. I don't know what we're calling them yet. I'm sure eventually we'll figure it into a rhythm. A mini mega game or kilo game or whatever you're calling it. I'm calling it a large scale RPG with mega game elements, but it doesn't really roll off the tongue.
So not easy to
Which
say.
No, it's a 10-player game separated into two teams. Neither team can sort of see what the other team's doing. And it's about a bank heist with one team being the gang inside the bank and the other team being the authorities outside the bank. And I'm hoping to release that soon with a sort of here's how to run it online version, which having now preparing to run that stuff myself online this Saturday as a test, it seems surprisingly easy actually. So I guess keep an eye out for that one if you want some mega game adjacent content that you can do during the current times. But yeah, that's pretty much me. Follow the Facebook page or check out the website or join the mailing list or something if you really want to stay up to date.
Okay. Do you fancy squeezing in one more question? We've got one more question that's come in.
Sure. Yeah, throw one in.
Okay. From Syntax, any thoughts on team size of these number of teams? Is there a target number of total players you shoot for when designing a mega game?
I wouldn't say there's a number of players I go for. It's more I design the game and then see how many players there are in it. One of the reasons why Shogun Edition only has 30 is because that's how many there could be. There's only really four factions officially. Thankfully, because there are three maps, it does mean that there's more players for the maps, and that kind of helps flesh out the game in terms of number of players. Um, but yeah, so it's no the game decides how many players it has. I don't decide how many players I want a game to be and then design for that. Um, some people might, and that's fine, but that's not how I do it. Any thoughts on team size versus number of teams? Again, for me, who's on a team and why is almost a narrative thing. Like each faction should have access to sort of each mechanic, assuming that makes sense. It may not if it's asymmetrical, and each faction will need people who represent them in different ways for different reasons, and different factions within the faction that have different perspectives, and that's how many players need to be on the team. So whether or not you need to combine teams or not depends on sort of all that kind of stuff.
Okay, okay. Well, brilliant. Thank you very much, John. As he said, he's got a website and he's on Facebook and Twitter. So go follow him there and keep up to date. This is the third of these streams that I've done now. Next week we've got Ben Hirsch coming to do an AMA with us. Ben's the lead game designer at a biotech company and the designer of Starships and Six Shooters, which is going to be running with Horizon Mega Games later in the year, delayed because of coronavirus. And I'm really excited to have Ben on. He's Avid Gamer. Avid Gamer. We went over to Gen Con with each other last year, and his kind of perspective as a game designer for a company, a Biogen company is really interesting. So I'm looking forward to that. The week after, we've got myself, Chris Brown, and Harrison Tatum Wyatt of Mega Game Assembly, and the other two guys do We Love the Internet as well. So we thought we come and answer some questions. So between the three of us, we've been to probably about 160, 170 games now. Kind of founded Mega Game Assembly and have had contact with a lot of the groups across the world. So hopefully we've got some interesting stuff for everyone to ask us. So and after that we've got Seamus, who is one of the founding members of True North Mega Games, designer of a fantasy Mega Game, Seasons of... Can you remember, John? I've forgotten the name of Seamus's Mega Game. That is very
I,
embarrassing.
I remembered it until you asked me.
Yes. Okay. Well, I apologize for that. But
Kingdom of Seasons.
Kingdom of Seasons. There we go. My
Yeah.
apologies, everyone. And that he'll be coming the week after. And we've got Darren Green, creator of Arrival, who also runs Mega Games for kind of team building days, a company. So we've got a full schedule going on. Later in the week, I'm also going to be streaming the uh, second online mega game that's coming from the guys in America, which is the sports mega game, as it's been coined, which is about kind of drafting in this crazy fantasy environment. And then on the 2nd of May, I will again be streaming online Den of Walls. And on a Wednesday night, Becky blogs, Chris Harrison and I play Pandemic, so tomorrow. Come and join us to see how we get eaten by a virus. So if you could please follow the channel and Twitter, Facebook, and all of that, I would be very appreciative. And I hope you've all enjoyed it. And thanks very much, everyone. And thank you very much, John.
Thank you for having me on.
Thanks. Bye, everyone.
Goodbye.